All right, you're live.
Hello, this is our fourth session on progress and poverty. We're taking up book 3, which is titled The Laws of Distribution. And just to jump right into that, I've got a chart for the live audience here, the on-site audience. The distribution of the net produce of the economy. In other words, we're talking about the material goods that are produced by the economy. And in the analysis of political economy, we say that that gets divided into 3 mutually exclusive categories. This goes all the way back to people like Adam Smith and David Ricardo, John Stuart Mill, some of the classical economists came up with this framework. So the produce gets divided into rent, which is a return to ownership. There's a return to land, the qualities of a site, wages, which is a return to human effort, human exertion, and interest, which is a return to, in George's writing, to the capital goods that you've invested in product tools and machines and raw materials, intermediate products along the way before becoming final products. And there's, in George's view, there is a return that's due to that investment in material capital, and he calls that interest. So the first thing I want to point out is that these are abstract analytical categories. Okay, George is very careful about his definitions and about being consistent, and they all differ from everyday usage. We all know that the same word can have many different usages. Okay, so the word force, we might use that in everyday language, and then if we're a physicist or if we're talking physics, we have a more specific, precise meaning. And so that's the case with these terms. These are technical terms used in political economy. So rent is not what we pay our landlord. That's a lease payment. That's landlord's rent. We call that rent in everyday language. But in political economy, rent means the return to the value of that location. Okay, let's give a simple illustration. Let's say I'm in the business, I want to sell clothes. I run a clothing store. And let's say I've got 2 locations. One is on 34th Street and one is on 134th Street. Now the one, where am I going to make more sales? Obviously the one on, we're in Manhattan, the one on 34th Street. And even with the same, even if I invest the same amount of, have the same size store, hypothetically, okay, I have the same workforce, same amount of workers, same quality of workers, I've got the same machinery, capital, the same, an equivalent building. So after all my costs, outside of rent, get paid, my net income, let's say on 34th Street, let's say it's $1 million. And my net income before rent I'm talking about, let's say on 134th Street, it's $100,000. Okay, so that net income is different. And is that difference due to my efforts? No, it's due to the value of that location. Okay, what makes a location valuable? Primarily, the biggest land values are urban. Okay, Ricardo was talking about richer soil and the agricultural, but it overlooks the importance of the urban values, which are many multiples of what the agricultural values would be per acre. So it's the presence of population density, a lot of commerce going on, a lot of economic activity going on near that location. That's what makes that location have a higher potential, have more advantages, whatever word you want to use. It's a greater opportunity there. So that difference in the net is not due to my efforts, it's due to the value of that location that has to do with the surrounding economy, the surrounding community. If I went out to, I don't know, East Kansas or Western Kansas, outside of a city, I could set up the same building and try to sell clothing, but I'd probably incur a loss, right? If I went somewhere where there's not schools nearby and, you know, fire protection and transportation, all of these things add to the value of a location. So, again, the word rent is different than everyday use in political economy. So if I go back to my illustration with these simple numbers I'm just making up, okay, $1 million here, $100,000 here, that difference is not my wages, it's not interest, we call that rent in political economy. That's due to the location, the value of the location. Okay, now wages, pretty simple, it's what I get in return for my efforts. Okay, how that differs from frequent usage is that we're not just talking about hourly wage labor, okay? A salary, that would fall under wages in political economy, and even entrepreneurship, entrepreneurial effort, self-employment, the return you get is termed wages. If I have a farm and I grow vegetables, you know, the return the return I get is the produce that what I produce. So, or the income I get from selling that produce. So this is, now again, if I own a farm, I also own the opportunity that location gives me. Maybe I have richer soil than some other location. Again, the difference would not be called my wages. That difference would be called the rent of that location. So it's not landlord's rent, it's the difference in the values of two locations, of how much opportunity there is, you know, for revenue, how much desirability there is if we're talking about a residential, you know, place to live. I'd rather live where there are better schools, I'd rather live where there is transportation than somewhere where I don't have those things. So the prices are going to bid up because it's going to be more desirable. So that's the basic breakdown distribution. Now let's go back and talk about some of these other terms that lie behind this, okay? Again, this is a framework that George built upon that was already set out by the classical economists. The three factors of production: land, labor, and capital. Again, the terms are technical terms in political economy, so we want to distinguish them from just any everyday use. So by land, we don't only mean dry land, okay? We're including the air, the oceans, the rivers. We're including the electromagnetic spectrum. We're including the natural resources in the ground. We're including things like airplane orbit, you know, courses and so on. All these things are not created by human labor. In other words, that's the endowment, the environment that's given to us. The natural universe, the material natural universe, that's what George means by land. And for the most part, classical economists in general, that's what, although they might have been more focusing on the agricultural dry land. But George defines it quite clearly: the entire natural universe except humans and their products. So everything that we're given without labor is land. All the opportunity that exists, the fact that there's gravity that we can use to get hydropower, all these things are in that category of land. They have some real value to us when we mix our labor with the land. We're able to generate wealth and services, goods and services, which are things which satisfy a human desire one way or another. Even if it's dog food, you're desiring to feed your dog. You want him to be well fed and so on. Now, capital, again, is material goods. Capital is a subset of wealth in George's definition. So nowadays, the word capital often refers to all sorts of things financial, right? Wherewithal to start a business. I would say over 90% of the use of that term nowadays is, if you look at material things which are used in a productive process, which are used, and his final definition, he comes to wealth in the course of exchange. So even the cans of beans on the shelf in your store, in your little deli store, your grocery store, those are capital until you buy them. Okay, it's wealth that's still in the course of exchange. You get it home and put it in your pantry, it's still wealth. It's a material good produced by labor, but it's no longer capital because you're not using it to generate an income or to generate commerce. Okay, so the three factors of production, land, labor, and capital, combine to produce material goods, wealth. There are also, of course, services, which are a growing part of our economy, and they certainly involve labor in providing services. What George is doing is focusing on the material, sort of the storehouse of society's goods. So services are used up in the giving of them or whatever. They're not a material good that has that sort of tangible existence. So the other classical economists before George had already spoken of productive labor versus unproductive labor. And they didn't mean unproductive in the sense that maybe it's worthless. It's still labor, but if it's a service, they actually use that term. You can find that in, I think, Smith and Mill and so on. So we're focusing on, when we talk about wealth, when we read George, it's important to know what he meant by it. We can say, oh, I don't think that's a good definition. That's another discussion, but if we want to read George with understanding, it is important to understand what he means by his terms. And he's very careful about that. So let's go back and look at these definitions in a little bit of detail. Wealth, okay? Material goods, simplest way I can think of to say it. There are four criteria that all wealth satisfies in George's usage, okay? They have to be material, they have to be made by labor, so land is not wealth in George. Money is not wealth. Stocks, bonds, these are not material things, they're not made by labor, okay? It has to satisfy some human desire, feeds you, clothes you, does something that satisfies some human desire and has exchange value. So those are criteria that wealth satisfies. And then when we talk about capital, again, in George, remember, capital is defined as wealth in the course of exchange, or wealth being used to generate a revenue. And he goes back to Adam Smith's words to that effect. So capital then is a subset of wealth, okay? If it's a rake sitting at home that you use to rake your garden or your grass, it might not be called capital. But if it's on a farm that's a commercial enterprise, then it would be a tool we would call capital. So your tools, your machines, your buildings, in course of exchange, those are capital. The raw materials you buy to make your manufactures, the intermediate goods, the final goods, the merchandise on the store shelf, all these things are capital in George. And none of the financial stuff, he makes that distinction. Now it gets confusing at times because obviously in the economy we exchange things, right? So we use money as a medium of exchange, and a certain amount of money can be considered equivalent to the value of that machine. So nowadays, so often when you hear the word capital, it usually refers to a number rather than a physical thing. But so the terms that are in present day use might be physical capital, or there's fixed capital and circulating capital, such as your merchandise. But even under circulating capital, they include things like overhead costs and operating costs. So then we're getting out of George's use of the word capital. What's another one of the terms? Fixed capital, physical capital. Anyway, I think I made the point. Now, a couple other terms here: production and distribution. Okay, what is production in George's usage? That is not only the manufacturing of a product, the transporting of it is part of the process of bringing it to the ultimate satisfaction of desire, right? It hasn't got into the hands of the consumer yet. That can of beans goes on a truck, ends up in on a store shelf. That's part of the production process. And the store itself, the cashier, the people stocking the store, the accountant doing the books for the store, all these things are still part of production until that sale is made and the consumer, the buyer, takes it home. Then it's up until that point, all of those processes are part of what George calls production. So I wrote making and bringing wealth to the user. Okay, so, and then by distribution, we're not talking about warehouses, distributors that are intermediate places where goods go from factories before they're bought by the retail outlet. That's again, not the usage here. We're talking about the net produce of the economy gets divided into three mutually exclusive categories. One is a return to the value of location, and we're calling that rent. One is a return to the human exertion, and we're calling that wages. And then one is a return to the investment in capital, and George is calling that interest. So again, very different than everyday usage that we're used to. You're just talking about interest on a loan. Okay, so just have to be clear when reading George what he means by these things. Okay, so, and then he points out that the produce is the wealth produced beyond capital replacement. Okay, so capital has to be maintained, right? It's gonna need maintenance over time. It's gonna wear down in terms of tools and machines. You're gonna eventually need to replace it. So over time, the part of the return is going to go into replacing that capital. And so he says, well, so we can disregard that part and just talk about the net produce is the wealth produced beyond just maintaining your capital. Okay, and so it's that net produce that gets divided into the three avenues of distribution: rent, wages, and interest. Okay? And book 3 is about the law of rent, what determines how much rent is. Just want to point out that, well, let's just go ahead and go right to it. Book 3, the law of rent. Rent is the difference between the productive potential of one site as compared with a marginal site. So I've already made the point that valuable location is the difference. The same effort, the same really, the same effort deserving the same amount of return, which would be called wages. But the difference due to location, that's what we call rent. You know, whether it's outright paid to a landlord or not. We're just talking about the difference in the potential in one location versus another. All the advantages of the one location, less the disadvantages. Now, a corollary to the law of rent, since those three categories, rent, wages, and interest, make up the entire produce, they make up 100% of the produce, and they're mutually exclusive. So the corollary is the law of wages and interest taken together. And George says that really the primary distribution is dual, not tripartite. So what's not rent is what's left for wages and interest. Or you can actually see it the other way around. What's after wages and interest get the minimum that can maintain them, that can bring them into service. What's left we would call rent. So it's just a simple arithmetic. So he calls that, he calls that a corollary to the law of rent, the law of wages and interest, so that the produce minus the rent is the wages and interest. And on the other hand, the produce minus the wages and interest is the rent. And where he speaks of this corollary, what he has done in book 1 and book 2 is to debunk some theories about limits to production, which were being used, and still are, to some extent, to explain away what George called the great enigma of our times. In the preface, the introductory chapter of Progress and Poverty, he started out by saying, well, the present century has seen enormous increases in productivity, wealth-producing power, inventions, and so on, machinery, greater division of labor, and the productivity of labor is multiplying. So one might have thought that the condition of the laborer would improve, that we're on our way to poverty being non-existent because we're 10 times as productive as we were 100 years ago, or maybe 100 times as productive as we were 200 years ago. So why isn't poverty going away? As a matter of fact, it even seems to show a tendency to increase as material progress in a society. So in a rudimentary settlement, like before the Declaration and all, and people came to to America in the 1700s, the 1600s. Everybody was probably doing something, could do something for their own, make a living in some way or another. The opportunities were there, okay? There's land, there's, so that opportunity is there. And then as he was in San Francisco when he was a young man, and he was watching it change from a small town to a large city, and watching growth of huge fortunes and so on, and alongside it seeing tramps and beggars and thieves and all sorts of poverty conditions growing up right alongside it. And he was even more shocked by the same thing when he came to New York in, I think, 1880. And just to see how shocking the disparity was between the opulence and the sort of misery that he saw. And so he said, this association of poverty with progress is the great enigma of our times. It is the central fact from which spring industrial, social, and political difficulties that perplex the world, and with which statesmanship and philanthropy and education grapple in vain. It is the riddle which the Sphinx of fate puts to our civilization, and which not to answer is to be destroyed. So this is the problem, the issue that he's taken up in this famous book, Progress and Poverty. Why haven't we solved poverty? Why does it seem to be more and more intractable, even despite the tremendous material progress? And so in book one, he takes up one argument that, well, why wages are limited is because they get paid out of a wage fund, some kind of pre-existing fund, some kind of capital that's been stored up, and you need that in order to pay your workers. And so the more people there are needing work, and there's this wage fund, you're dividing by a bigger and bigger number, that's going to depress wages. So this was an explanation, sort of a justification for status quo. And George debunks it. He says labor creates its own wage. Okay, if I'm working in a car factory and I'm putting doors and parts onto cars, so they might not have sold it yet, but it's capital, right? I've created new capital for that factory owner. So my labor has already created the wherewithal that my wage comes out of. And typically I get less than what I've really created, right? So labor creates its own wage. That's the true wage fund, is the output that's being produced. And no business could stay in business if it was paying out more than what was being produced by the labor. So that's pretty simple. So that was one attempt that was what he said was a prevalent theory among the classical economists that didn't really accord with the law of rent. It didn't really explain what regulates wages and why we have this problem of poverty. And then a second theory that he debunked was the Malthusian theory about population. So Thomas Malthus wrote a famous book that was talked about in the last session called On the Limits of Sorry, I don't recall the exact title of Malthus's famous work, but it came out in 1798 and several different editions.
I think it was the essay on population.
An essay on population, yeah, thank you. And his idea was that population grows at a geometric rate, but the ability to produce food and wealth can't keep up. So by analogy to an animal kingdom, he says salmon will, if they're in the absence of their predators or whatever, would fill the sea, right? The reproductive power in nature. So the theory was that there's going to be pressure on subsistence from the growth of population, and this is another convenient way to justify the status quo and say, well, that's why we have poverty. And so he debunked that. He pointed out that our output actually increases with more denser population. Because you get greater division of labor, you get the processes further refined, you get new inventions, the capital becomes more and more powerful, the machines and so on. And so the productivity increases per capita. And Steve, in the last session, read from the famous Unbounded Savannah passage in Book 4, which is about the effect of material progress upon the distribution of wealth. So what happens to the proportions of the net produce that are returning to rent versus the proportion that's the return for human enterprise, right? We can put labor and capital together because capital is like stored up labor. So those are the productive, the active, well, the human is the active force, and labor uses capital to increase its power or productiveness. And the passive factor is land. So you've got the passive factor and the active factor together producing goods. So where was I? Okay. In the example of the unbounded savannah, okay, somebody goes out and stakes out a claim on some land out in the middle of nowhere, but it's rich soil, and he wants to be his own man, has a family, and grows his food, and makes a living. But he has to be kind of a jack of all trades. He can't even send his kids to school because he can't afford it. I mean, there's no teachers nearby, and it's not a whole community there, but then someone else comes. And they could settle, 3 miles away from him and have equally good farmland, but they're probably going to settle closer than that. Why? Because there's going to be benefits for both. Because, one might have more blacksmithing skills, one might have, shoe making skills, or and all these things that are needed. So more and more settlers are going to come, and they're going to settle in this cluster nearby, and the economy is going to grow. And the productivity, the per capita output, is going to actually grow due to the increase in the density. And the other thing that happens, if we talk about advanced societies, he was talking about how the population was doubling every 25 years. Well, if you look at early America, I looked up some records of, say, the 1700s, early 1800s, and in about a quarter century, it was doubling back then. It was a new, relatively unsettled country, and that was the case. It's no longer the case. What happens as economies become more advanced, we have what's called the demographic transition, right? The growth rate slows down. And so it just hasn't proved to be true that we're all starving, just because the population is, 4 times what it was in George's day or in Malthus's day, right? So both of those theories were looking at the production side of things, okay? The wage fund theory was that you only got so much capital to be able to produce, and that's limiting how much we can produce, and that's why there's poverty. Well, no, labor creates its own wage. Labor is not limited by capital. Labor uses capital. It's not the other way around, where the dominant discourse today still is. It's capital that's the job creators, or the people with lots of money, and so on. Labor creates its own wage. It's really not the reason why opportunity or jobs are hard to find or whatever. It's not due to the limitation of how much there is there to pay it because, again, labor creates the wherewithal to pay itself. And that's, most obvious if a person is just working for themselves. You're creating, if you're growing your own tomatoes, that's your wage. So, and the Malthusian theory was another theory that was about limits to production. We're not going to be able to produce enough when the population keeps doubling. Eventually we're going to, unless people slow down the reproductive activity, then with prudential checks, we'll have the positive checks of starvation and disease and so on. One way or another, the population is going to stay within the ability of subsistence. Well, it's still the case today. Enough food is produced to feed the entire population of the world. So why is there poverty? That's just doesn't explain it. So it's human arrangements, and they're not in, they can't be found in in these fallacious theories about limits to production. So we have to look at the distribution of wealth and what is it that's regulating where it goes. Okay. So the law of rent, this is really a very central, key primary part of the book, Progress and Poverty, because this is where he's pointed out, well, those theories don't explain it. And so this is the central point. This is the primary place where you're getting the key to the answer. Why is there poverty? So the rent of land is, can we take a break?
Oh, well, I guess we can maybe open up.
Or just let's have questions, because I'm starting to run out of steam, and I think what would be useful if I can get you guys to grapple with it in your mind. What is the law of rent? Do I understand it or do I not? And let's just talk about it.
Yeah, I got a question unless somebody wants to take the mic first. Yeah. Okay. My name's Marty Rowland. I'm going to be teaching next week on the second half of book 3.
Right.
I guess I wanted to open it up and let the viewers watching this on YouTube, that be an archive, is to understand that when Henry George was writing Progress and Poverty, throughout the book, and especially in book 3, he makes this point that the current theory on political economy, it's all wrong. So he's coming out there, if you can imagine somebody just standing up front of the Congress and say, you guys are all wrong, you're doing it, see, he was pretty much an outcast, but he appealed to the common person that wanted to understand economics. And when you get to the points that you made, earlier in this class, I used the term intellectual gutter talk to put a stronger emphasis on these falsehoods to drive people away. And really, the answer to Malthus is, yeah, that's true if men were cockroaches, but men have brains and they can figure things out. And when the materials of comfort and such happens, the population rate goes down anyway. But the whole idea is that there's things thrown out to get people off understanding economics. And it's very clear that he's saying that it's the rent that's keeping money going back to capital and wages. But I guess my question, I wanted you to respond to this because, you're gonna get it in this class or some other class. And it's another intellectual gutter talk, which is the idea of profit. And in the book 3, he goes at length saying that essentially it's a dirty word because, and maybe I'll give you an opportunity to explain why the word profit is an imprecise term in relation to the 3 factors.
Yeah, well, profit is an imprecise term for economic analysis because it can include, part of it might be rent, part of it might be wages, part of it might be returns to your capital, or at least what you get to be able to maintain your capital. So if you're the farmer and you own your property, some of what you're getting is rent, and some of it is your wage. It's just not, it's an accounting term. So you take the gross revenue and you subtract all of the costs and you come out with the net income. And that's the term profit. It's an accounting term, but it doesn't give us an economic analysis of the distribution of wealth that the political economists were after. And I would also mention, Marty started with suggesting, well, George came along and said these theories were all wrong. Well, these particular theories were wrong. I wouldn't be quite so. I mean, he took a whole framework that I think the classical economists did set out that did make a lot of sense. And he worked with it, and he worked to make it more consistent. He pointed out where they were inconsistent, where it didn't square with the facts, it didn't square with reason, with following the same line of reasoning, and so to say wages are regulated by some pre-existing fund just didn't square with the law of rent.
Yeah, before I turn it over to somebody else, I want to point out that Henry George said dividing the production on rent, wages, and profit, which is wrong. He said it's like dividing mankind into men, women, and human beings.
Yeah, right. So you don't have mutually exclusive categories. You have imprecise overlapping things that don't help you get a clear analysis. Sure, Ralph.
How we doing?
Good.
Okay, we got another question?
Yes. No, I just wanted to point out that our wages are not given fairly because of the need of the employee, and they take advantage of people that are looking for work to determine. They give you a determination. I mean, their determination of what you're going to receive, and yet you haven't, got on the production line, show how productive you can be. So your wages are set for you. You know what I'm saying? You're not really setting the wages, and your production. So your production, whatever you produce, you're not going to get things back to you fairly because of your need. So they
Sure.
take away from your wages automatically because of your need to just survive.
So the question is about the exploitation of labor, that the fact that you need the job and that there are many people that will compete for maybe not a fully living wage, and you're sort of coerced into taking what crumbs you can get, and his point was that the employer is taking advantage of that fact. I would only say that I don't think browbeating or moral talk is going to change these things. I think we come back to the basic incentives that are built into the society and that are built into, let's come back to the first axiom that George states in the introduction of the book, that people seek to satisfy their desires with the least effort. And that's only natural. I don't think this is something evil about human beings or about other creatures. If I want to come to the school here and I live in Queens or Brooklyn, And that's my desire, is to get here for a class. I'm probably not gonna take a roundabout route where I go up to the Bronx or go to Staten Island and take the ferry and then eventually get here, unless that's also part of my desire, to have a scenic route or to do something else along the way. I'm probably gonna take the 7 or the 8, whatever train gets me here most directly. It's just common sense. We seek to satisfy our desires with the least effort. We're gonna take the direct route to go where we're going. If I want a loaf of bread and there's the same loaf by the same manufacturer, the same bakery, in one store and another store, and one store has it for $1, another has it for $1.50. I'll probably buy it for $1. I mean, all other things being equal, if they're equally easy to get to, I like the owners just as well, whatever, I'll buy it for the $1. I don't think that's something evil in human nature. So companies are faced with competition themselves, you see, so they're dealing with the same set of issues.
So I just want to say, so you're saying it's okay for them to abuse us. I'm just saying, you know, when you're saying the desire, but I'm just saying, the way our families, our mothers and fathers came here and were living here, their mind was more set on just surviving. So they would give you that everyday work effort on the job. They wouldn't really look for that comfortability because they were being, in a sense, forced to develop, you know, the product or whatever it was at that certain rate. So you had to keep them satisfied. It wasn't a thing that you were looking for. You couldn't get the satisfaction. You understand what I'm saying? You had to keep them satisfied to continue to get those wages.
Yeah. Well, that's the nature of working for someone else, is they're paying you in return for you doing what they want you to do. Yeah, the question was, originally when people came, they could work for themselves and they could make their own wage, where now you're subject to an employer's desires and you're subject to that minimizing effect on wages. Well, this has to do with the law of rent. You know, the land has been, we have a legal system that enables private property in land, protects private property in land. And the legal power of owning land is that you get to decide whether somebody else can be there or not, right? So you can exact a payment of some sort for that land. So if now the entire United States, if you drive around or travel around on trains or buses or whatever, you'll see that there's a lot of empty open spaces, but it's owned. Yes?
Okay, this one.
Just a quick question. How does this apply to intellectual property? Because there is no land in intellectual property.
Okay. Yeah, the question is, how does this apply to intellectual property? And that's a very important question and a very important issue to be grappled with. I'm still working on it. Definitely, just want to be clear. Well, that's something, again, that's written into the law, as is private ownership of land and protection thereof. So the protection of patents, claims, trademark, copyright, and so on. And these legal claims can have an economic value, right? You've got a patent and you can sue some other company. You can't do that because I registered the patent on it. And I've got it for 20 years, or whatever the duration of the patent, and if I'm able to get it renewed for however long that lasts, you have to do it a different way. It has to be different enough that I can't win a lawsuit against you. And I think that's a very controversial subject. I think in the area of software, you have a tremendous amount of economic power going on with the gigantic companies that are wielding a lot of it. And I definitely would agree with the Free Software Foundation in being opposed to patents in software. So you're basically patenting an algorithm, a method of doing something, a set of logical steps. There was even a story that I think Amazon patented the one-click purchase. And somebody like Apple might actually pay them a little royalty for every one-click purchase, just for using the notion that it's possible to program it, that works. So I'm not going to come out and say I'm against all patents, but in the software, I'll definitely agree with that.
Medicine
So
probably.
we can all agree that intellectual
Medicine, yeah.
property is a result of labor, right?
Oh, yeah, sure.
But
Oh, you've got a question?
what I don't understand, I never heard it before, where it said rent is a surplus.
Yeah,
And it's very interesting because in a way that's what's happening now. Because, I don't know, the economy is good and people are earning more, and so there are certain things they don't need. But if you go around, you've never seen so many empty stores. So that almost sounds that you say to be in real estate, collect rent, you almost can't collect rent all the time if labor and capital is doing so well. And it's very hard to understand that, because usually there's a shortage of properties, a shortage of
right. So,
places for people to live. I don't know whether that might have something to do with the fact that rents are so high and that labor doesn't make enough to afford the rent. It's like
Yeah.
a circle that keeps going around, it never splits.
sure.
You know, I don't know, I never heard this.
All right, well,
Rent
so,
is a surplus.
yeah.
And I think it's a fabulous expression, and it makes you look at rent in a very different way. I'm not sure, is there an explanation for this?
Okay, so I heard a couple things there. Rent is a surplus, being a phrase you hadn't heard before. You said there are a lot of empty storefronts, and why is that? And why is the rent so high that you can't make enough to really make ends meet? And those are all part of the same set of circumstances, the legal arrangements that we have in society that I think have everything to do with things like granting absolute private ownership of the land. That you, in spite of the fact that it's not due to your efforts that it has that value, it's due to the surrounding economy that makes a location have a high value. And so a lot of stores, you see, go out of business. I wonder how they stay in business when I think about it. I wonder what they pay. They probably, in New York, in Manhattan here, a small little bodega or place, maybe they might be paying $10,000 in rent. They might be paying $30,000. I mean, I think I asked a restaurant on 14th Street, a friend of mine did. What's the rent? It was about $35,000 a month. Okay, so they've got to clear over $1,000 a day in net just to pay the rent. And so then when that value, when that potential is rising, they might, often things sit idle because they feel it has more value. They can save the expense of maintenance, and they're going to wait for a sale. And rent is, again, another way that the word rent differs from everyday use. Rent is basically the component that makes up the sale price of land. Not the part that is the price for the building, but the part that's the opportunity of that location gets capitalized into the sale price. And-
We have a,
No, I just,
Yeah.
well, I guess we want to give everybody an opportunity.
Yeah, other questions?
I just
Okay.
want to piggyback on what her answer, the answer she was searching for. I'm just saying,
Yeah.
with technology and all that, your clothing stores and all that are doing worse, much worse, because you can buy things online. And another thing that we're not really noticing, they're keeping us people, laborers, on a rush. We're rushing to get to work, to other places, to do things that we don't have time to really stop by a store. And if we do, we'd rather get to where we're going than to stop by a store. You know, things are difficult. They're keeping us out of there. And then the people are not really making enough money to afford those rents to open up a business. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
They're making us, afraid to move forward, and they're just gobbling everything up, you know.
So,
Yeah, I got an answer to that.
Go ahead.
all right, go ahead.
Okay, well, maybe at this point, we've been going on for about an hour. I think you're doing a great job. And I do want to do a little plug for the Progress in Poverty series that we're putting on YouTube. So one thing we didn't announce at the beginning is that the slides that Alan's referring to are available on the website. So if you want to go back to the beginning of this recording and take advantage of the slides, might be able to see some of the points that Alan's trying to do. But this is the Henry George School of Social Science, and anybody associated with the school will or should accept the premise that Henry George always made, and essentially it's the theft of these public resources that we call rent. And that's the heart of almost all the problems that we're talking about. So it's kind of like Ralph's main issue about we're all rushed around, where we have to accept these wages because that's what they give us. And if you go back to the original or the primary principles of Henry George, you'd see that the evil is the fact that we're not collecting that unearned increment of land value. So it's like all these problems in the world, we could debate for a year and year, but if we don't address that one problem and take 100% of the unearned increment of land value and give it to society for these things like infrastructure, for the police, for education, and for whatever else we want, when the unearned increment, which we call land value, goes to the government, pay for the things that created the land value to begin with. If the government decides to fill up helium balloons and just let them go up in the air, that's okay, because it's not some landowner's balloon that he lifted up. This is what the city chose to do. We're going to just let these helium balloons go up in the air. Now that's crazy, but I'm bringing that up because there's not like this ownership that the landlord pays this to the city as rent. It's no longer his. So if the city decides to feed a homeless person, nobody has the right to say, well, that's my money going to feed that homeless person, and he should have some kind of beef about it. The problem is that we're not collecting that under an incremental tax or land value. And so if we're not doing that, debating other things about what we can do, like shifting money from the lottery or whatever the solution's going to be, we're not being true to the Henry George principles. And we need to be, especially if we're in this building talking about Henry George and Progress and Poverty, because he has the title of the book is talking about the remedy, and it's a remedy for what we see, this increasing poverty because of the the problem with the distribution of wealth. And the distribution is the rent not going back to society, because it's society that created the land value to begin with. So I think that kind of addresses Ralph's issue about why aren't we getting more wages? Why do we have to just take whatever the employer wants to give? It's because the society hasn't done what Henry George recommended and, spent his whole life trying to create. So
Yeah, can I put in
we
2
have
sentences
to
here?
address that.
Yeah, I agree. I would just say, Ralph, when you're saying, well, they do this, they make us run around, they don't pay us enough, and who's they? The way I view it, the way we view it, is that the system, the legal system that we live in, and it's a tall order, right? It's not something we can flip a switch or vote on Tuesday and it's gonna change overnight. It's a gigantic issue, but we're saying this is the root of the problem, is in the whole legal arrangement that we have, where we're granting absolute ownership to pieces of the earth, and it's all divided up like a monopoly game. And it ends up being an unjust arrangement. And so it's not any one individual, it's not one president or one business CEO or business owner that's to blame. It's a whole system that we feel is dysfunctional. And the distribution of wealth is between rent and human effort.
Rent and what?
And enterprise, effort, wages, interest. And so the question is, should we let it be a monopoly game to get that rent, right? Pay someone whatever they're willing to accept for it, so now I can own it, and maybe there's a new subway and it gains in value and I get that windfall. This is the game we're playing.
Any other questions? I think we got.
Well, this is not the only game. There are different compensations for different jobs, for different occupations, and they don't make any sense. Because if you look at it as kind of supply and demand in work, so try to find a mechanic and try to find a lawyer. I don't know what's going to be easier. I think to find a lawyer is going to be easier, yet he's going to get a lot more than the mechanic. Why?
Right.
Why? And the mechanic today has to know so much just to repair a small car. And
Yeah.
why?
Well,
Where is it? What happened?
so the question was, for example, why does a lawyer easier to find than a mechanic, perhaps, but the lawyer probably gets a lot more for it. And so are there other factors involved? Well, I guess that comes down to the number of people that are more hands-on people that take up mechanics and versus the number of.
It's harder to find a mechanic, so that means that it's the less.
Well, you said it's harder to find one. There are fewer of them. There are fewer of them.
Or an electrician or plumber or.
Well, okay. Well, it might be the cost of location, is that it's harder to make a living in that, so it's harder to find one. And lawyers, of course, have to go through all kinds of expensive schooling to get where they are, and they trade that investment of time and money in return for, their fees that lawyers get. The devil's in the details. I guess we'd have to. Why are there fewer mechanics? Why is it harder to find a mechanic?
I've got an observation. The people who run for office and get elected, who pass laws, if they were all gardeners, then we'd probably have a different society. But the people who do that are lawyers. And then they write laws and they create jobs. So that might be one thing that.
They create their own jobs, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, just just as what you were saying about location, I mean, I see it just from shopping. I prefer to buy my vegetables from a street vendor than the supermarket because I know the prices are lower because in the supermarket they're paying rent.
Sure.
And that goes for like, you know, electricians, et cetera. They have to pay rent
Yeah.
in order for people to go to them.
Yeah, and the produce is often better on the street vendors than in the supermarkets, except for the higher, more wealthy areas, supermarkets. Yeah.
Well, we got a great discussion going on.
Because I think the public today has become more aware of vegetables and everything, of the quality. And I
Yeah.
think the quality today is, you know, like Whole Foods and stores like that, is very good. Well, sometimes, I happen to like also the street vendors, because I think it's another way you meet someone who has a different take on it. But you also have to realize that a lot of those vegetables spoil because of the weather. If the weather is too warm,
Yeah.
or it rains, they get dirty, or whatever the thing is. So you gotta look at everything from both sides today. And I think there's another thing that's important. I don't know, I could be all wet about this. In Henry James's time, there was no unions.
Henry George, you said?
What?
You said Henry George.
There was.
Well, you know, age is creeping up. What do you call it? In Henry's time, there weren't any unions, and the way they created wages and stuff, I think was different from what has happened today. I think the unions have had a tremendous impact on wages and people's ability to work, because they have almost said, if you don't pay them this much, they can't be hired. And I think all of that affects what's going on with rents and growth. And how do we look at that today in relation to Henry and his philosophy? Because I think that is something that they don't have the power any longer that they used to have. But they're still there. And I think we have to put that into the equation of what's happening today so we can continue to grow. I don't know, it's just a thought.
Yeah, I know, Ibrahim had something to say about the utility and futility of labor unions. Did you have an answer?
Yeah. Well, you mentioned labor unions didn't exist in George's day. I'm not sure that's entirely true. I think there were American Federation of Labor, and so it goes back.
He belonged to them.
Well, he
Yeah.
was supported by the American Labor Society.
But you're saying today there's not much, they're not doing much for the worker. And I think
They've lost their power.
they've lost their power. And I think that's true, yeah. But of course, George's outlook, and I agree, is that the labor union, I mean, I don't have anything against it, but I don't think it's going to solve the bigger problems in society. Because, okay, so who's in maybe gets a benefit over who's not in. I think it's good to do collective bargaining and make use of whatever tools you have in your hands to get the best deal you can. But it's not going to solve the issue of land value, land being all owned, and the values in the urban areas where the jobs are being created are, the land is held, and so so much of what we spend is the price of location. And if you think about not only what you pay your landlord, what you pay when you go into a store, think about what they're dealing with. They're dealing with $30,000 or $60,000 lease for a small location. How are they clearing, netting $2,000 a day, not including what they pay their workers, not including what they pay for the food, just to have that location.
Yeah, we need to clarify that 1886, when Henry George ran for mayor of New York, he was on the United Labor Party. So he was, you know, so definitely they had unions. Maybe not as well.
He's not against them, but they're not solving the problem
Well,
he's
yeah,
taken
well,
up. They're not enough to solve that problem.
Let's Ibrahim
That would
have
be-
a say.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think Nina has a point, because if you look at recent history from the 1950s to the early 80s, we had powerful unions. Of course, we had big business, we had big government, but powerful unions also played into the social compact of the day. So wages were kind of reasonable, I would say good by today's standards. Now, what we notice also is in the 1980s, when supply-side economics became the main guide for policy, it started with the unions being busted. And immediately you start to see on the graph the disconnect between productivity and wages. So some people concluded that, well, when you don't have unions, wages tend to go down. That's true, it gives them a bargaining power, but the problem is how long can that situation last? Today we live in a globalized economy. If wages go up, what happens is capital tends to move away from using labor, but just go the way of using machines. Like all this automation is taking place because wages are high. The second thing that they have, another second pressure that's happening to unions or wages is if you unionize, businesses move out and go. Okay? So if you want to have unions, go ahead and have unions, but we can close. Okay? So those are the two factors that has to be taken into account. And I think it should make us think about George's remedy, who believed that he has nothing against unions. And as Marty said, they supported his candidacy to become a mayor. But he understood that if you want a final solution to the wage or the wealth distribution problem, you have to address the problem from the first principles. Establish an economy that is based on justice so that you don't have to have unions and so that you don't even gonna need social policy. And the reason why we have social policy, social safety nets, is because we don't have an economy that is operating according to the principles of justice. So you address the problem from the source, not by attacking the effects.
Yeah, exactly. Address the problem at its source, the cause of the problem. The only way to really solve it is to remove the cause of the problem. And I just want to point out, we pay rent doubly. We pay double rent. No wonder we don't have enough to make ends meet, because we're paying twice for the value of location. We're paying, we're paying our landlord, okay? So some of that is the price of the location. And then we're paying, right, income tax, sales tax, and other taxes, okay? We're paying all sorts of taxes and fees that are being used to run the government, provide police protections, what goes to schools, healthcare, fire, streets, transportation, all these things are what give value to these urban areas that brings the rents up. Well, we pay it twice because we pay it into private pockets that are the owners of those locations, as do the store owners that we buy, where we buy our bread and our dresses and shirts. Okay, they're paying that value of location into private hands, and then again, we and they are paying the taxes that are providing the environment in which that land can have that value in the first place. So we're paying for that value twice. And no wonder there's not enough to make ends meet.
I've got another observation about the vacant stores that Nina was talking about.
Uh-huh.
It's apparent that if there's a store that's vacant and it's been vacant for months and years, it's obvious that whoever owns that land and the building are not being assessed a high enough tax, I suppose you could say, to encourage them to do something different. It's really a loss to society to have this vacant piece of property there, because they've got all these utilities like water and police and fire and all that. So if we had something productive going on in that, it would be a help to the rest of us. So it's almost like a topsy-turvy economy that we got, that we're allowing people to maintain these empty stores on these lots in prime locations, and they're just getting away with it
For a
being
pittance,
speculator and just waiting for the big payday. Likely they've got friends in the planning department, because they know in a few more years it might develop, so they're just sitting there like Henry George would say, like dogs in the manger, just waiting for that opportunity to come. So if we had a government that had a sense that the unearned increment of land value needs to go for these things that we're talking about, they'd say, well, okay, there's a prime opportunity. Let's find out, what are we assessing this person who has this land with a vacant store and all this, and find some kind of level where they say, well, shoot, if you're going to do that, I'll sell, or I'll do something different. But there's nothing pushing, apparently, there's nobody pushing that this vacant land or vacant store to do something different.
Incidentally, a little factoid I came across just a few days ago is that there are more empty dwellings, I guess houses and apartments in the United States, than there are homeless people. Many more. I looked it up. There's some Federal Reserve data on the St. Louis Fred website that has it at 17 million. There's 17 million vacant dwellings in the U.S. right now. So it's not that there's not enough housing.
You got a question?
I have a comment.
Yeah.
Hi, how are you?
Hi.
I've been reading the book, so just from what you guys were saying earlier, the overall, when you guys were talking about the property taxes probably aren't enough, does that mean that you are projecting that land value taxes of all the buildings will just increase in its value? And if those vacant lots, that encouragement, is that something, because a lot of those vacant lots are not going to be filled with commercial businesses, because there's many reasons why there's vacant lots right now. It's just true that lots of businesses, first of all, it's hard to run a business and to stay open, to stay afloat. It takes,
Of course.
It's very unique businesses that survive more than one generation. But one thing that I can see, like you guys were talking about, why there are empty dwellings, there's more homeless people, that if they can maybe switch those areas into more residential, because residential is something that is needed more than commercial lots. So I just wanted to know that every time that we've been talking about this, because I've come to the previous classes, is the projection that land value tax, if it's the only sole tax that's something that's wanted, is it going to be more than the combined property tax, income tax, or is it this big?
No, it would.
Because otherwise, it's very hard to sell this idea to other people.
I know, that's right. You're bringing up a...
Because I've been trying to talk to other people about this, but then they're like, how is this going to be such a cure? And I'm going to still be taxed less, especially people that hold a lot of property. It's very hard to get them to, accept this idea. So if you can just kind of help me understand that better.
Yes, well, let me make an attempt here. The question was, well, how can we sell the land value tax? And people hear the word tax, and they're like, oh, even more. You want even more out of me? Well, that's not the idea. The idea is that the rent of land is really rightfully belongs to society. Really the earth belongs to the earth and its creatures. As a whole, it shouldn't be the situation where a lot is being held vacant for years. That's just waiting for it to ripen into a sale. It's simpler for them to not bother with, you know, putting up a building and maintaining it and, you know, dealing with the tenant and their issues and everything like that. So they just sit on it because they're only required to pay a pittance for their land, in spite of the actual potential of that location, whether it's commercial and the fact that it's, you know, has a potential to generate a pretty large income for a clothing store or what have you, or whether it's a residential place that's desirable, so it has a value, and yet it's sitting there, that value isn't being realized, and the person sitting there holding it is not paying that value. So the property tax, they assess the building, they assess the land. The assessments of land typically are much lower than you actually observe in actual sales that occur. The actual market prices are typically much higher than the assessed values, but nevertheless, even if they were the correct value, then the percentage charged against that value, assessed value, is anywhere from 0.5% to 1% to maybe maximum 2% in whatever state or locality we're looking at. Whereas the rental value is probably closer to 8 or 10%. And that's an enormous fund. George is saying, why are we disincentivizing labor? Why are we taking the fruit of our labor when the wherewithal to run government is right below our feet? Forget all these other taxes. It's very inefficient machinery. You know, the cost of, you know, the income tax rewards cheaters, right? It's very intrusive in our privacy. You're supposed to fill out this return about what you spent and keep records for 7 years. And just the cost of complying with the income tax is enormous. The cost of sales tax. And what we're doing is we're putting the burden on the productive sides of the economy and a relatively light burden on the holding of land, which isn't really fair. If you're holding that land out of use or in use, either way, that portion that's, again, the value of that location, the difference between that and some other location that's not due to your labor, you should be paying, society should be collecting the rent. And we don't need all these other taxes, and it would really be a much simpler world to live in. There'd be much more open opportunity to find a place where you could run an enterprise or where you could afford to live, because you wouldn't be paying your rent twice.
Let me add to that answer and say that the Henry George movement has been around. You know, Henry George wrote this book 140 years ago, and they had various campaigns. I encourage everybody to look up this free book. It was written in 1916, and it was called The History of the Single Tax Movement by a guy named Young, I think his name is. But a lot of good descriptions and reasons why it didn't take off and such. But right now, like what Bashar was talking about, the single tax, the difficulty of selling it is kind of like selling a lead balloon. So you don't see any lead balloons because they don't have much value. They just plop to the ground. You know? So that's really where we're at. So maybe one of our students, maybe one of our instructors will come up with this system that would incentivize, you know, kind of like with Henry George idea of doing something with the least exertion, where somebody says, okay, I'm up for this land value tax, and immediately at the same time, my income tax goes away, I don't pay tolls to go across bridges, you know, I show them my card that I'm paying a land value tax, and I get away with all this stuff, and everybody says, well, I want that too, but how do we snap our fingers and make that work? It requires people to get into legislatures and such like that to make it happen, because we know where the money is. It's just that, like with all these lies that were talked about, the that the wages come from capital and the population problem. All these things that are thrown out to us to say, well, I guess the world is terrible, I think I'll just stop complaining and just work my wages. So it's like we have to have this excitement about what could happen. So we know where the money is and where, because a successful city like New York City is just, we're just brimming with trillions of dollars of land value that aren't properly collected. I mean, they do collect taxes on various things that just de-incentivize people to do things like, taxing people who are producing things, taxing people that work for a living, but then the distribution that's going to landowners is, that's where the money is. So I think the answer to your question is we have to find the mechanism so that when you snap your fingers and say, now I'm a land value taxpayer, that it means something positive because he's getting this benefit. So we're not there yet. We're at the lead balloon stage, and we have to figure out how to do something different.
Yeah, and just to carry on a little bit, because this is the key question, it's very hard to have conversations outside of the school because you find a lot of resistance. Oh, how could that work? Oh, are you going to make me, what about the poor widow, or what about you're going to make me pay even more? As soon as you hear that little three-letter word, there's a very negative reaction. And personally, I focus on the analysis right here in book 3 and book 4, that let's just see the validity of the clear thinking that's there in analyzing what's going where and why. Never mind the remedy, maybe we think we'll never achieve it, maybe we disagree with it, but just at least understanding that these are the dynamics we're living in. And that's a beginning. And just understanding that, in my view, this monopoly game legal arrangement we have doesn't work. And if people, it might be easier to I'm not very good at it personally. Outside of people that already kind of are inclined to agree with me. Because it's just a paradigm shift. It's a whole paradigm shift that we don't make the earth. Why should we be dividing it up into little kingdoms to collect the value from it? And it's bigger than any one of us. Yeah, Ralph.
I just want to say that you're absolutely right about having that switch of understanding of how Henry George thought about things, and we love to follow him, and how society, our difficulty is society itself is run on its own economics. So everyone here, we live in the life of Henry George, but yet when we go outside, we live in the life of that economy that we have to survive in.
That's right.
So now, that's how difficult. And then the people also, the needs for the normal person, that's why they don't have that much affordable, they call it affordable housing, right? But yet they have enough for the people that have, that are rich, that could afford residentials anywhere they want to live. The rich are covered. They don't care, you know what I'm saying? They're covered for them, for their survival. But now us, we're worrying about it every day. So, if we speak to them, say, if I speak to my boy and I say, listen, you gotta understand, there's something that's better than this, but yet, since he's making his money on the economy outside, that's making everyone else live under it. You know what I'm saying? Like, what I'm trying to say is that when you go outside those doors, that way of living, it's right in front of you, so you have to survive it.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, you're saying outside these doors, that's right. The world we're in.
And then when reality is that you're crying, the public is crying for affordable housing, for affordable this, affordable this, that they can survive it. And they're afraid. You know what I'm saying? A lot of people are afraid just to exist against the realities that's out that door.
Yeah, well, this is what we're all faced with. George writes sort of an epilogue of Progress of Poverty. It's called The Problem of Individual Life. And so we're all faced with that. Maybe this remedy never happens in our lifetime. He thinks ultimately, this is going to be the only way that we can overcome this dysfunctional situation, but it might not happen in our lifetime. So meanwhile, what do we do? And he goes into spiritual aspect of life.
There's one statement that anytime I head off, like for someone that's making it out there, and this is what they tell you, leave God out of it. But in reality, George lived under God's vision.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying? As far as the things that are needed for people to survive every day because of what he went through himself in life. So now, but what they do out there, they say, the corporations and all that, they say, oh, leave God out of it. Because if they were to put God into it, they would know that we would be right. That's one thing I believe. That's why I've been coming to the school for over 10 years, and I still believe that, they need to be awakened in a sense.
Now you know why you come. So it's good, I'm glad you did this.
Yeah, well, George is definitely a very spiritual person, not in a church-going way, but in a very sense of, the divine and God or whatever, the spiritual element in life. And, getting back to the world out there, I guess what we're trying to put in is the ability to just not buy in, this is just the way things are, population increases, there are all these things in nature of things that are just causing it to be this way, and it's just the way it is. Life's hard, and I don't buy into that, It's the way it is, yeah, but it's not the way it has to be,
Right.
And I just don't buy that. So we're just hoping that people can get a notion that, understanding the dynamics that are causing, having these effects. And we have to think about the cause. And if we become aware of that, we can realize this isn't the best of all worlds, it's just the world we're dealing with right now.
Well, here's an idea. We all can agree that Donald Trump kind of broke the mold for what a president is. So maybe in the future there's going to be a Georgist running for the presidency, and he's going to ask, what do you have to lose?
Yeah.
I tell you the truth, I believe that he's taken a lot of things that we have projected to be good for people, because as far as the work, jobs concerns and all that was our concern. They were for free trade at first, and then when we started questioning that, now they swear, oh no, we go put protectionism to show something else. You know what I'm saying? So I know that they're following our beliefs, but yet manipulating it for their ability to seem that they're doing something good.
And who are you talking about?
Donald Trump. Trump and the whole book, the way that America is moving now is to satisfy the people. Now that they're trying to show that they're more concerned with the people having labor and all that. But they were taking all those things away, and they're still trying to plan how to take things away and keep us, chasing that carrot that's in front of us, just for us to eat.
Another question.
Okay.
Well, first, I respectfully disagree with Rowland about Trump, because that's not at all what they're trying to do. This is just another lady in a red dress. This is everything that he says. He'll go on TV and he'll project something, but policies are completely opposite.
Yeah.
I don't think the Republican Party, and specifically Donald Trump, is a friend to the Henry George School. I just want to put that out there. But just a comment to what Ralph and what you were and Marty were saying, that I'm a very hopeful person. I actually see that the time we're living in right now, it really can't get worse than this, in the sense that I think people have awoken to understanding how lots of different types of people, particularly in the upper rich classes, have been cheating the system and not paying taxes. Because it's not only information about Donald Trump, it's information about his son's family, how they've been cheating and not paying federal taxes in order to. So a lot of people have awoken that, you know, if I did that, I'd go to prison, you know?
Yeah.
And they're understanding that, oh, I always looked up to people that made such ridiculous amounts of money, and they're actually people that should be in orange jumpsuits. They cut this level of wealth because the tax code, they were able to use and abuse it to their benefit. And even if you want to blame the tax code, there's still a lot of suspect things that they did that if some attorney general wanted to look into, I'm sure they could get them on that, you know? So, but I actually think that this is a very hopeful time for both Henry George's idea because there's three reasons. One, people have awoken to how corrupt the tax system is. Second, climate change is a real thing, and it's going to be affecting all of us. When it does that, whether it's, you know, it's very sad to the realization of where that's going to be. Lots of New York City's not going to be here anymore, you know. You can pretend to live in a la la land about that, but these things are, you know, they say 12 years.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's just being hopeful so that, you know, we don't scare the younger generation or people stop having children that they're saying that. I think it's already on a trajectory that it's going to be very hard to pull back from. So, and then the third thing is, whether we like it or not, whether we believe people are going to do it, there's a billionaires race to try to inhabit other planets, to go to the moon.
Yeah.
So these ideas, if they're not going to like them here, they can start them in the moon. You know, I mean, these people are going to want to start from getting property there. I mean, once it's successful, 10, 20, 30, 40 years, 50 years from now, these ideas are why I was making that comment and question earlier is people understand and respect that very idea that land is really not yours. They get that. Even when they're like, even if I buy a property, really how much is it? Because will my property expenses be able to survive even the next generation? They're well aware of that. My family came from Pakistan about 40 years ago. And we go back and forth there. We have, we live there, we have a home there as well. Over there, they're just more honest when you buy land there, or you buy a home there. They give you maybe a 90-year lease. They give you know that this is not yours forever, you know? Maybe you'll get a 50-year lease. Maybe you'll get a 100-year lease. The thing is that idea, Americans right now are uncomfortable with, I really won't own something. But if they think about it, they really don't own it anyway.
Yeah.
You know, they're in perpetual debt.
Right.
So if anything, this is going to force an honest conversation. I'm very hopeful because I think that he's kind of brought everything bad to the surface. And if we have good leadership, good leadership comes from, people like us that kind of try to push and encourage people, to go out there and to run for these offices and then hopefully give our votes to them. That if they can help change the culture of the American dream, the American dream is not sustainable anymore. It's going to change no matter what. And it's going to change either because of climate change or it's going to change because we just can't keep up with the types of, the trajectory that we're on. That in itself will allow these ideas that might seem so obtuse in this room to, the average layperson because they go out there and they're like, well, it's not my fault. I'm just trying to compete in the system that I live in. But human creativity, we're going to have to start creating more sustainable cities. This is a perfect tax for sustainable cities because it encourages people it'll encourage a whole different types of, businesses that will come forth from this. Right now, the businesses that come from is the system that we live in, which is really a lot of it is greed-based. And it's not about a sustainable, it's not holistic living. And I think for the most part, Americans are good people. I don't care what Donald Trump or his ilk like to show Americans as. I don't think the majority of Americans, they see their brother or their sisters, how difficult things are for them because they see it in their own household. People have a lot of, dignity in this country. But when they go back home, they realize things are very tough. People don't even see their incomes anymore. They're gone before, they're able to even look at it. These ideas these can get out there, but, maybe we need to, politicians that we think that would have an ear for it, start talking to them about it, because the world is changing, America is changing, and there's going to be a gravitation towards the cities, more the way the population is going, and if we just recognize where we are and where we're going to be, we read all of these articles and we know all what's going to be happening in the next 10, 20, 30 years. He might we wrote these books about 100 years ago, but I think they're more prevalent than ever.
Yeah, as relevant as ever, and I think
You wanna run for office?
No.
I'll vote for you, definitely.
I mean, I must say, you don't have to go far. I just came back from Puerto Rico. I volunteered there to rebuild housing. There are no Republicans there.
No.
So,
No, I have a friend that's been working very hard for Puerto Ricans in the Senate, who's solely, working with one of the very few senators that cared about what's happening in Puerto Rico. And, we have a president that denied the amount of people that died there. So this is the state we're kind of in right now. At one point, Americans are going to have enough with the lies, and they're going to want to see true change. I know right now it's hard. It's hard to say that because he's calling upon nationalistic nativist ideas that aren't like, what Ralph was saying. Ralph is being very positive about them. He's thinking of them without the racial undertones, which is a good thing. We want jobs back in this country. We want to be able to make our own things, but not at the cost of what really the Republicans are kind of allowing Donald Trump's rhetoric to go to the loose end,
Yeah.
So there are really good people. I do believe politics isn't dead, There are very good people out there. They're just up against a big machine,
Yeah.
And
I agree.
they're all trying to, go up against, the big corporate world. Corporate world should not have been a negative word, but unfortunately, the system that they live in, they take wherever the benefits they can without looking at the greater good. It's only very few conscious businesses that, really go opposite, the type of benefits they can get from cheating the system. That's really not where the United States of America, unfortunately, encourage businesses, through its capitalistic mold, whereas other countries it's a bit different, So I do think I'm very hopeful. I think we should all be very hopeful. I wouldn't come to these classes if I wasn't. I think this is the absolute right time for ideas like this, and I encourage everybody that it's just a beginning conversation to start having it with people, Whether it's, your friend that hates the idea of being taxed, or it's somebody that's just seeing the extreme disparities, and they might give so much in charity, but they really understand that how much my charity goes only so far.
Yeah.
People are still living, in horrible conditions, and things are just going to keep on getting worse for them. So just have a good conversation with people.
Good.
One of the takeaways I got from that excellent analysis by Bashar was that I think we need to have a GoFundMe page and have Progress and Poverty typeset on some kind of lithium tablet or something, so that we can have like China to ship it to the moon, and then we get all the publicity. Like, why is China sending a copy of the Progress and Poverty to the moon?
Well, I really appreciate what you've said, and the hopefulness. Crisis can be opportunity. So this may be the time when a lot of people are seeing through the lies, and so it could be a time where change can happen.
That happens.
Mm-hmm.
Poverty doesn't make as much news, exciting news, as wealth.
Yeah.
And I think that plays a part where even though we know it exists and if you go into certain areas you see it, but what is shown to the public is that higher level. And
Sure.
I think why poverty has a problem, because there are programs out there for poverty, is that is not brought to the face of the public. And I think the other thing with tax, to change the subject a little bit, the thing about the land tax is that people who own property already pay taxes on that property. So now, you're either gonna have to rephrase it in some way, because how could you expect them to pay a tax that they're paying now, and then pay a land value tax? I think that's what's also hurting it, because you can't say that people who earn property don't pay taxes on it. They do.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, and I think that's also, because I've spoken to people, and they'll say to me, it's just like it's taken me a while to understand land tax, or land,
Value.
the whole thing with land and workers and all of that stuff. It's very hard for people to say, oh, well, I'll be willing to pay a land tax, but I'm already paying a tax. Why don't you just change the phraseology and call what I'm paying the land value tax?
Yeah, we've been going around 2 hours now, so, are there any other questions? And maybe you can wrap
How
it up.
do we get rich?
Buy land.
Become wealthy. What should I do?
Get a,
Buy land?
find distressed property, a distressed seller, and buy low so that you can sell high. That's the way money is made.
So we all agree that we had a great conversation tonight?
Yeah, interesting.
Sounds good. So you wanna maybe wrap it up, and then we can, close
Wrap
it out?
up. I guess I want to give a tout to the importance of the monetary system, because obviously we've got a legal system and private ownership of land. Well, how are we controlling land? We're controlling it with money. We get bank financing, and I teach a whole course in money and banking because I think it's endemic and goes hand in hand with our private ownership of land, is the private creation of credit. That is what we're using as money. So that power in credit is how land is being controlled, and it's inherently wrapped up in what George is talking about, though George didn't talk much about the money issue. And just want to encourage you to read the book. I hope my slides are useful. I gave a little excerpt out of Ricardo's Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, where you see right in the first paragraph of the preface how the framework that George is working with is laid out right there. You've got the land, the labor, and the capital applied to it getting divided among the different factors that go into producing wealth. And so he's already talking about that in the preface, although he uses the word profit, which, as we have said, is a misleading term. George tries to use the word interest. I find that difficult as well. But then on the next slide, I show where Ricardo starts explaining the law of rent. So that's a well-accepted result in economics, the law of rent. It's just sort of downplayed and not paid much attention to. It's too uncomfortable to the powers that be. So classical economics sort of got overturned with neoclassical economics. Right around the time George was writing, it was getting displaced by neoclassical economics. Land was rolled into capital, so everything's capital nowadays. And so if you go back and understand the physiocrats who preceded the classical economists, who saw the importance of land, the primary importance of land, that is still the case. And then you go to Adam Smith, Malthus, Ricardo, Jean-Baptiste Say is in there, and then you've got James Mill, the father of John Stuart Mill, and then you've got Karl Marx and Henry George, all worked within pretty much that same framework of the three factors of production and working to find out what regulates the distribution of wealth. Okay. Thank you.
When is the next class?
I believe it's next week.
They say they're having something here on the 30th.
Yeah, it's next week, and then I think there's a week off, and then it's the following week.
All right, so next Wednesday.
Next Wednesday, yes.
Oh, because we've been running every other week.
Skipped Yeah, there was 1 week skipped where there was a 2 week in between. But I think the next one's next week, and then following 2 weeks later. It's in your syllabus, in the readings, book 4. Well, you should be reading the second half of book 3 if you haven't already read the first half of book 3. So chapters 4 through 8 in book 3 would be prep for next time.